So I've done a couple of things. I've got the 5 separate searches that Simon sent the codes for. So for example, Xylem vulnerable migrant ever, it would have the various codes that we've got, the SNOMED codes. So that's the 5 searches. And then what you can do is have a search that just pulls any of those 5 together. So if anybody's in this group, so I've got 14 that I've identified in my practice. Interestingly, yeah, it surprised me that we don't have any Roma Gypsy coded. I think mostly the temporaries. We'll have to think about perhaps can we pick up the temporaries somehow slightly better on some of these. No sex worker coded. And I was chatting to some of my partners. We know we've got patients, but we're perhaps not coding it. And that's a deliberate choice. And I suppose it needs further conversation. I've got a few example mice to show perhaps how we can demonstrate a protocol that would flag up when you've got a patient in front of you who has an inclusion code. So say, for example, this mouse, if I test this mouse, the alert will show history inclusion concern, and it'll say history of homelessness, related codes and recorded homeless family in 1983. So I think it's useful to have what the term was, what the date was. I've got a few other examples. So Clean Mouse has got a history of inclusion concern, history of contact criminal justice code in records, release from prison 31st January 2019. So I've just left it as history inclusion concern, but if you hover over it, it'll tell you what the code of concern is. So I suppose it's just ways you can play with it, and I'll just show a couple more examples. So this mouse, oh hang on, sorry, forgive me, I'm just going to the other things. This is the thing with all my other pop-ups. So this is some of the other assurance concern things. Mice have got a lot of things, they've got a lot of issues, but you can see they've got history inclusion concern and asylum or migration code, asylum site with application for asylum refused in January 22, for example. So you can sort of have it so that it runs constantly and just flags up. If you see a patient where there's an inclusion concern, there'd be a little alert or pop-up. I don't know if that's what we want at the moment, but it's just give you an idea of what is possible and how we could perhaps work these codes. I think that's quite discrete. You could decide on a form of things. I'll show you the sex worker one. So CKD Mouse has got a concern that says, it just says history of sensitive code and records, child prostitute in 1984. And I guess, we could decide, is that enough? You can build templates for reviews. You can include these things in the chronic disease template. So you could just have an extra box in some of these chronic disease templates. So say, for example, if I was reviewing their chronic disease, and this one's CKD Mouse is to do with CKD QI, I'd create another box in here that might say, this person has got an inclusion concern. And you would have an extra section in here that just says inclusion concern, saying what that concern is, and you might say, that's been taken into account, or whatever it is we want to do with it. It may well be that some practices are coding some of these things more readily than others. I'm conscious that we're sort of, we're quite rural and deprived. There tends to be coding for criminal history and homelessness, although I know there's probably an awful lot more of our patients that just we're not coding these. And that might be some of the things that we highlight early on, is that we do want to record some of these things so that we're aware of these, we're aware of the higher vulnerability of some of these populations.